Some cows, both male and female, naturally have horns. So happy cows would be horny cows if dairy farmers didn't burn and mutilate the heads of young calves. Stopping disbudding, the practice of cow mutilation. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, the painful disbudding of young calves, what a PETA eyewitness saw at one dairy farm.
And in the process of working there, saw a worker use a searing hot, red hot iron, jammed it against the heads of calves who were about 12 weeks old. No pain relief given before that was done, no pain relief given afterwards. And the whole purpose was to burn, literally burn and char off those animals' heads the very tissue that in some time would have grown into horns.
Dan Paden, a director with PETA's Cruelty and Investigations Department, describes the video a PETA eyewitness took, and it happens in more than just one dairy farm. It's standard operating practice at many, but it's painful to the calves to remove horns without painkillers, and it mutilates them for life. More on disbudding and what you can do to stop the practice. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. This is episode 52. Is going vegan one of your resolutions? Find out how PETA's vegan mentors are here to help in episode 25. Still wondering about ditching your Canada Goose jacket? Stay warm and vegan. Listen to episode 44. And animal testing is always an important issue. Find out how it's just a welfare system for scientists in episode 11. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes. If you're so inclined, we'd love to hear your feedback. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. If you didn't know that cows, both male and female, had horns, well, don't worry, most people don't. But worse than that is the quiet and secretive way that horns are removed by farmers who normally escape unnoticed. Now, because of PETA's video, law enforcement in Wisconsin has information that could lead to a criminal case against Heifer Solutions in Porterfield, Wisconsin. I talked to Dan Paden of PETA's Cruelty Investigations Department, and we begin by talking about the practice of disbudding.
Dan, first of all, thank you very much for joining us here on the podcast. Before we get into the investigation, I think some people might be surprised to find out that cows grow horns. I mean, we see photos and no horns usually. Do all cows have horns naturally?
So many people drive by dairies and they see, the black and white, the traditional stereotypical, so-called dairy cow, black and white Holstein out on a pasture or in a barn, no horns on their head. The vast majority of cattle, of the breeds used in dairy production, so Jersey cattle and Holsteins, for instance, they are born with tissue that will grow into horns, and that's males and females. And so when someone drives by a dairy and they don't see horns on those animals' head, that's a pretty good indication that those animals went through something called dehorning, which is kind of a catch-all term for the removal of horns, or at least the tissue that grows into horns, from the tops of those animals' heads in a variety of agonizing, stressful, and most likely very painful ways.
So let me get this straight, because this is a very natural thing. All cows have horns, males and females?
The vast majority do. There are several breeds of cows who are typically used for their flesh and not raised for milk. And those animals, those breeds, are not born with horns. But the vast majority of the cows used, at least in the United States, for milk production are born, male or female, they are born with tissue that grows into horns. Yes.
Because a lot of people would think when you see a horn, well, that's a bull, that's a male. They wouldn't see a female with horns, but females have horns in some dairy cows if they were allowed to be natural, if they were allowed to grow naturally, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, that's one of the ways in which these animals would look vastly different if the dairy industry wasn't messing with them. You know, I mean, their udders probably wouldn't be hanging to the ground, and they wouldn't be in such terrible body condition with their ribs jutting out of their hide also. But yeah, they'd have horns. Absolutely.
Because a lot of people would just say, well, of course cows, well, first of all, they think it'd be a gender thing. Oh, the males have horns because the bulls have horns, and we've never seen a female cow with horns. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's not genetically modified, but they are artificially modified by dairy farmers, really.
Yeah, it's very similar to how, if someone looked into a factory farm of pigs, they would not see long tails on those animals. They wouldn't see a scrotum, the male genitalia on the male pigs. I mean, factory farms, by definition, mutilate these animals in a variety of ways to make their own jobs and to make these animals' so-called value more and make the jobs easier to the workers, essentially.
Well, you used a key term there, mutilation, because there's no doubt about it. That's what this is, mutilation, right? And people are abhorred when they talk about mutilation in different third world countries, etc., and mutilation when it happens in human sense. But I don't think anyone realizes, or certainly PETA has when we talk about this case, but I don't know if people generally think of animal mutilation in the same way, do they?
No, they don't. And it all stems from the conditions in which these industries keep these animals. I mean, when you take an animal who's born with horn producing tissue or born with a long tail or born with this or born with that, and you put them into a highly crowded, stressful, filthy situation, whether that's a pen or a crate or a feedlot or a shed, you're going to see a lot of animals with injuries, and you're going to see an awful lot of behaviors they're going to take away from the so-called value of that animal's flesh or milk production if you don't mutilate them. And so it's just a function of the way in which the animals are kept that, in the industry's view anyway, necessitates, cutting off parts of animals, burning off parts of animals, always without any pain relief, whatsoever, simply so that you can keep these creatures in such miserable conditions and keep them for as long as you can profit off of them.
And it's all for the benefit of the factory farmer. And the animals, if they were to be, to be left on their own, if they were to be born, they would have their horns and they would be just out in the pasture, right? I mean, or is that some kind of fantasy? That never happens, right? Because they're on this treadmill of the factory farm. And so we'd never see that. Or are there wild cows that have horns that we see roaming around?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there are. There absolutely are. I mean, it's like, if you think about sheep, who the human species has bred and selectively bred for many generations to produce so much wool, so much unnatural wool that, that the shearing twice a year is a necessity at this point, unfortunately. Now, there are sheep in the wild whom, man and woman haven't messed with, haven't genetically manipulated for eons, who grow just enough wool to keep comfortable. And when they want to shed some of that wool, can rub up against a rock or rub up against a tree and keep themselves comfortable. It's the same thing with cattle. There are cattle out there who have not been messed with, who have horns, and who get by just fine, with that.
But it's a small percentage of the cows out there, or as you put the cattle. I mean, they are there like farms that are especially humane and don't dehorn and don't mutilate the cattle.
In PETA's view, and I think anyone who takes an honest look at this, anytime you're keeping an animal of any kind for profit, that animal's welfare is going to pay the price ultimately for that profit. I mean, there are certainly less cruel ways to do it. As Ingrid, our president, says, it's better to, kick a dog 6 times than 7, right? So it's marginally less cruel. So these animals are still going to suffer regardless of how they're kept on a dairy. For instance, calves are always going to be torn from their mothers at a very young age, precisely so that the milk she's producing for her newborn calf can be taken from her in a parlor and put into a jug or sent off to a cheese plant. What PETA is pushing, obviously, in addition to veganism and people, electing to buy and consume the healthier vegan alternatives that are out there in abundance, thank God, in almost every grocery store in the U.S. by this point. What we're also pushing in the interim is for the dairy industry to breed the naturally hornless cattle breeds out there who can be used for milk production. So there are types of cows and cattle out there who, by genetics, were born without horns, can be used for milk production. And therefore, that's one less stress and painful experience that those animals have to endure in that industry, while people continue to drink milk and eat ice cream.
So the idea that there is a better way does exist. It's just that it's not profitable for the farmers, the factory farmers, to do this better way. And that brings us to the real point of our conversation, which is this eyewitness video that PETA has revealed about the Wisconsin dairy farm that actually burns calves' heads without painkillers. And this is, that was pretty startling enough. And I'm sort of burying the lead here, but I think I was more startled by the fact that the cows had horns to burn off to begin with. Yeah. And I think a lot of people might. So the big preamble was necessary to understand that it's natural for cows to have horns. We don't see it because that's how effective these farmers are at hiding this act of burning calves' heads. Tell me about the PETA video.
Yeah, so a PETA eyewitness worked at a farm called Heifer Solutions. It's in northeastern Wisconsin. I worked there in late 2018, and in the process of working there, saw a worker use a searing hot, red hot iron, jammed it against the heads of calves who were about 12 weeks old. No pain relief given before that was done, no pain relief given afterwards. And the whole purpose was to literally burn and char off those animals' heads the very tissue that in some time would have grown into horns. And so these young animals who, had just been pulled from their mothers recently, had their heads chained against a fence, and this man just pressed this hot iron against their heads. The animals would call out, they'd kick, they'd struggle, they'd do everything they possibly could to try to avoid that pain and avoid that agony. But, it's really all for naught because their heads are chained into a fence and there's only so much they can do.
And this is all routine, right?
At this farm, this was the standard practice, no pain relief whatsoever. In the U.S. dairy industry, it is a very common practice to burn this tissue off of these animals' heads. The recommended practice, according to veterinarians in the dairy industry, is that if you're going to do this, you do it a lot earlier in the animal's life, and you give them both, local anesthesia beforehand. Essentially kind of like a shot of Novocaine when you go get your tooth drilled out and filled at the dentist. So you give them something that numbs the area, and then you give them, essentially a painkiller afterwards, because the pain from this procedure lasts up to 3 weeks. So even if these animals are anesthetized beforehand, they're going to be in a significant pain for a while afterwards. And so you want to give them pain relief after to keep them slightly more comfortable and in a little bit less pain for as long as you can.
Well, this whole activity, which is called disbudding, this whole
Right.
process sounds borderline criminal. How criminal is it? I mean, does this footage show that this is really a heinous activity that should be at least, called to the attention of law enforcement?
It does, yes. We've submitted the video and some expert statements and a complaint to the local sheriff's office, who has forwarded it to the district attorney as of 2 days ago. And we're following up with the DA. We feel very strongly that this is clear evidence of violation of the Wisconsin cruelty statute. That law prohibits anyone from causing any animal, whether the victim is a dog or a cat or a Holstein calf on a dairy farm. It prohibits anyone from causing any animal, in the law's words, unnecessary and excessive pain and suffering. This is clearly unnecessary pain, precisely because pain relief does exist for these animals and is widely available, and the farm ought to be using it. I think, any layperson could look at that and say that those animals were suffering quite excessively. I mean, this is a very painful procedure. It's excruciating. And so we have very high hopes that the DA will read the law, look at the evidence, and read the expert opinions, including from a professor in the University of Wisconsin's system who teaches livestock welfare and cattle behavior, and agree that this is criminal. These animals suffered, and the legislature and society as a whole does not accept that, and that the right answer is to hold the company accountable with cruelty to animals charges.
But what does it say when farms, they may know the law exists? I don't know, maybe they do it out of ignorance. But if there are laws there, clearly the people to whom these laws apply are not listening to these laws, and they're doing these things like disbudding, really just flying in the face of the law.
Yeah, I mean, it goes to I think it goes to the fact that so many of these industries, the dairy, the pork, the poultry industries, all these industries, they carry out their cruelty behind closed doors, and far off of the roads. I mean, this is not in the public view, and that's by design, because I think they know very well. Every time one of these videos is released, there's an uproar, and people change their habits. They stop supporting the industries that cause these animals such gratuitous and egregious pain and suffering, and go vegan. And obviously, PETA applauds kind people who make those decisions. The other thing it goes to show is that, these farms, they operate under the radar of law enforcement. There is no state or federal regulatory agency that goes in and visits dairies or factory farms for the animals' welfare's sake. It is up to good people who work in these industries, who are disturbed by what they see, to report what they see to law enforcement, or if they would rather stay anonymous, come report to PETA, and PETA will work with them to alert the appropriate agency or authorities and try to make things better for animals.
And that's what happened here, right? Basically, an eyewitness took a video and was appalled. And this doesn't even come under ag-gag laws, the so-called ag-gag laws, which we've talked about on the podcast. I mean, these farms are just off the beaten path. No one sees them, and they just go about this kind of business of disbudding really with the disdain for whatever law does exist to prevent them from meting out this cruelty toward animals.
Wisconsin is the second largest dairy producing state in the U.S. And so to show that this is happening in that state and to shine a light on it, it's our hope that it really sends a message, long past and wider than this particular farm or even the county that it's in, but to the dairy farms across the state and beyond across the U.S., that it's 2019. And, maybe in 1969, it was acceptable to the industry to be mutilating animals like this without pain relief. But in today's day and age, thankfully those medications are available. And that pain relief, if we are going to continue to raise these animals for milk production, and the day that that's no longer the case can't come soon enough. But in the interim, if we're going to continue to do this as a country and as a society, those animals need to be spared unnecessary pain and suffering, and that includes when their horn tissue is removed. If we just don't start breeding for animals who are born without, the potential for horns and don't have to go through any of this pain and agony and fear.
Specifically, this case involved Heifer Solutions, LLC in Porterfield, Wisconsin. But the PETA alert does single out Dannon Yogurt and Horizon Organic Milk as companies that should be urged to move quickly to phase out this kind of practice. Does Dannon Yogurt and Horizon Organic Milk use companies like Heifer Solutions?
They use companies like Heifer Solutions. They have yet, here's this behemoth, this international, billion-dollar behemoth, and yet they have not made any commitment. They haven't taken the first step towards actually verifying that their producers, their suppliers, are going to start breeding for naturally hornless animals. And until the world goes vegan, that's the way to prevent these animals from suffering like this. No amount of pain relief is going to eliminate all the pain, let alone the fear and terror that these animals experience. And so the real answer in the interim is for companies like Dannon to require their suppliers to phase out this practice and instead to be breeding cattle who are born naturally without any horns whatsoever.
So Dan One is the parent company of Dannon Yogurt and Horizon Organic Milk. Can consumers really have an impact if they go directly to these companies?
That is precisely how these companies make their decisions, is based on consumers, based on what society is saying as a whole. We all hold enormous power when we go to the grocery store and when we take out that credit card or write that check or take out cash and make our purchases, whether it's groceries or clothing or cosmetics or anything else, what we do for entertainment. These companies are in this to make money. And the minute they see that they're going to make less money because they're not doing right by animals, that's what will be the impetus for them to change.
So when consumers see hornless cows, they should be thinking, this is a product of disbudding and this is bad. We should stop this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this animal, even if she's out on a fairly green piece of turf and has the sun on her back in the best possible scenario, she probably underwent an agonizing mutilation when she was very old. She was definitely separated from her mother. And if she's given birth to calves, you can bet they've been torn away from her within hours of birth, and they themselves have undergone that torture as well.
The so-called happy cow is not a happy cow.
It's a myth. It's a fraudulent advertising myth, just like the idea of, humane meat or happy meat or humane eggs. These things just don't exist. They're simply marketing ploys put out by people who are trying to pull the wool, so to speak, over good people's eyes. People don't want to support cruelty, thankfully, and the industries know that, and they're trying to sell them some sense that somehow they can eat animals, they can drink milk, they can eat eggs without supporting animal suffering, and that's a lie. The only humane diet is a vegan diet.
Dan Paden, a director with PETA's Cruelty Investigations Department. If you use dairy, call your favorite companies like Dan One and demand that they not use companies in their supply chain that mutilate cows' horns. See the video at PETA.org and read more. For links to the info, go to our show notes or just go to PETA.org. And that's our program for today. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com, AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Hey, on January 27th, February 1st, and February 7th, I do a one-man show on the little-known story of Filipinos in America. Emil Amok, Sex and Affirmative Action. Hey, it's all about Filipinophobia. Another chapter in our nation's race conversation. It's funny and not, just sort of like life. Check it out. What are you scared about? It's at the Potrero Stage in San Francisco. Go to amok.com for details. Hey, thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.